Walking around Portland the other day in Oregon, I walked past a pedestrian overpass that had writing on it. It was words that sort of extolled the virtues of the city. I don't remember what it said, and I can't find it on Google Maps now, but it reminded me of a recent episode of the podcast 99% Invisible. It's Roman Mars' podcast about design, where he was talking about the coming upon poetry written in a plaza in Manhattan on the gates, and how exciting that was for the people who found it. And that reminded me of a trip to Florence I took when I was a kid, finding a plaza a couple blocks down from the Duomo that had an arch at one side with writing at the top. And it said, I had to write it down because I didn't remember it, my Italian is terrible, I'm sorry, but it says, L'antico centro del città da secolare squalore a vita nuova restituito, which, thanks to Google and some web pages I know, translates roughly to the ancient center of the city restored from age-old squalor to new life. It's a beautiful sentiment, right? So I looked up what was going on there, and it turns out that that part of town used to be a dump. It was kind of a bad part of town that they then rebuilt into a place for cafes and shops and nice hotels. And when they were done, they put up a sign that said, this is what we did here, right? We rebuilt this part of the city. And all that got me to thinking about the power of inscribing words onto a cityscape. There are other examples of this, right? I mean, the Hollywood sign's a big one. It's essentially this big, a big head-up display that says where you are in LA. Or the Lincoln Memorial is another one, right? Where you have a statue of the guy and then two great speeches on either side. It's powerful stuff, and it put me in the mind of what an urban planning professor of mine once said, which was that a successful city tells its own story. He was in Boston, and Boston is a city that, man, cannot stop telling its own story, right? You've got the Freedom Trail and commemorative plaques everywhere. Even the tombstones are living history, or, well, dead history, I suppose. Part of that's because I think the per capita numbers for urban theorists in Boston are off the charts, but some of it is because the city knows itself. I actually think, though, that there's something more significant going on. You know, the human brain's tuned really highly to see edges and boundaries, right? And that's, if you think about it, a way of looking at cities too. It's what Kevin Lynch wrote about, an image of the city. Those are some of the key things that we think about when we walk around. So in a way, when we look at letters, when we look at writing, especially if you have not an ideographic language, but one that uses letters like English does, you're looking at highly simplified versions of the city that we're seeing all around us. It becomes all the more powerful to see those kinds of things written on the sides of buildings. Now, of course, there's signage everywhere, right? I mean, we see words and letters written on storefronts and in shopping districts and on street signs. When I was living in Japan in college, when I was at the peak of my ability to read kanji, which was never very high, I could look at these Blade Runner-y cityscapes with all the neon light-up signs flashing red and blue, and they contained information for me. I could tell a little bit about what they were saying. But while I was there, a friend of mine came to visit, and he didn't speak any Japanese. And I asked him what he saw when he looked at that same cityscape, without knowing what any of those ideograms, what those images meant. For him, it didn't look like information. It looked like art. And I think that's what's important here, is that when we inscribe these letters on our buildings, on the cityscapes, when we literally have the writing on the wall, we're putting information somewhere. But we're also putting art.